Have you ever wondered what happens when we die, or if there's more to our existence than what we can see and touch? Today, I sit down with Dr. Amy Robbins, a clinical psychologist and medium with nearly 20 years of experience. She's also the host of the podcast, Life, Death, and the Space Between. Dr. Robbins shares her journey into exploring the spiritual side of psychology and how it can help us heal. You'll learn about near-death experiences, communicating with loved ones who've passed, and how understanding death can actually help us live fuller lives. Stay until the end because I open up about my own experiences with the spiritual realm and how it shaped my approach to healing. It's a side of me you may not have heard before, and I wasn't expecting to share, but it might just change how you approach life and death too. You're listening to the Born to Heal podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Katie Deming. After 2 decades of practicing as an oncologist and caring for thousands of patients, I've seen firsthand how our healthcare system places obstacles in your path to true healing. My guests and I will bridge the worlds of Western medicine and alternative healing to help you achieve optimal health. Expect to uncover new insights, share a few laughs, and maybe even shed some tears along the way. But most of all, we'll learn how to heal from within together. So let's dive into today's episode. I am excited to introduce Dr. Amy Robbins, who is with me today. Amy, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So Amy's podcast is called Life, Death, and the Space Between, and she is a clinical psychologist in private practice for almost 20 years, but also has experience with special intuition and really this space around death and how death, we can use that as an advisor. People who follow me know that this is really close to my heart as well. So I want to start by asking you, Amy, with the podcast, Life, Death, and the Space Between, how did that start and how did you get into this kind of work?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk to your audience. So I lost my aunt when I was 18 years old. She had diabetes. She had juvenile onset diabetes, and she had really struggled throughout the course of her life. And when I was 18, she was just about 48. She was waiting for a kidney and pancreas transplant. And while she was waiting for the transplant, they had to make sure that her heart would have been strong enough to withstand the transplant rather than giving organs to someone who wouldn't be able to integrate those. And when they went in to check on her heart, it just was not strong enough. And so she did not survive the heart surgery and died on the table. And I came from a family of physicians. So this was my grandfather was a pediatrician, my uncle an orthopedic surgeon, my father a dentist. So this was really it was a huge tragedy in our family. Obviously, she left behind 2 younger children. I mean, they were college age at the time, but nonetheless, very, very difficult. And really I was in college. I came home for a short period of time, went back to living my life. And then fast forward several years to when I was in graduate school, and I had what I now know was my first visit from her. She came to me. It was in a dream state, but it was very different than a dream. And she came to me and she gave me 2 messages, one for my mom, her sister. And she said, "Tell your mom not to be upset. I'll be at the wedding." And my cousin was getting married, and she showed me very clear images of my mom standing at the kitchen sink in the home I grew up in. And then she gave me another message for my uncle, also a very clear image of my uncle pushing my cousin in a stroller when he was out walking and running. And she said, "Let him know I hear him when he talks to me, when he's out walking and running. I can hear what he's saying." So of course I was like, okay, this was interesting. At that time, I thought it was a dream. And when I woke up that morning, I called my mom and I said to her, "Mom, I had this crazy dream about Aunt Linda. And in it, she came to me and she said, you don't have to be upset. She's going to be at the wedding." With that, my mom started to cry, and she said, "I was standing at the kitchen sink last night talking to her, saying to her, 'I can't believe you're not going to be at the wedding.'" I then called my uncle, the orthopedic surgeon, who believes in nothing non-material. And I shared with him the same thing, what had been shared with me. And he said, that's when I talk to her. When I'm out running or walking, that's when I have my conversations with her. And so at that moment, I really knew something was happening. I didn't know what, but there was a shift that happened for me. And I was in my second year of graduate school. I went to one of my professors who I knew was really into Indigenous healing, even though she was very grounded in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So I was like, she seems like a decent enough person to talk to. I mean, I was also a new graduate student, so I was a little bit afraid to even bring this up. And when I shared it with her, she was extremely supportive and said, I think you're opening up to something. I think you need to explore this a little bit. And I didn't, because it was just, I mean, I was in the throes of graduate school. I was in a practicum and trying to survive classes. And I was I can't remember if I was newly engaged or newly married at the time, but life there was no space for me to start exploring this whole other realm that I didn't even know, what I know now. And so I really shelved it for a while. And then my papa died, and it happened again. And then it started happening with some of my patients' loved ones who started coming to me, which really kind of blew the doors off and opened me up. And that's when I really started exploring and kind of took the advice of this professor who encouraged me to go seek out a medium and work with a medium for a while. And that's really how these two things kind of crashed into one another, psychology and spirituality.
Wow, it's such a beautiful story. I have a question for you, two questions actually. One was that you described that after you had that dream, or the dream where you got the two messages, that after that you had a shift. And even though you weren't ready to make any changes in your life, can you talk about what was that shift that happened for you?
Yeah. So I really, after the death of my aunt, was riddled with anxiety. I think I had also had several deaths in high school of people close to me. I remember a woman that a couple of young women at the time, they were, 18 and maybe I was 15, that I really looked up to. One was killed in a car accident. One was killed crossing the street when she was abroad in London. And I really those deaths really shook me. They were young. I mean, I can still remember like every single death that I experienced in those very young, like those high school years. While I was in college, I mean, I would have probably now been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Then I didn't even know really. I mean, mental health wasn't what it is today where everybody's talking about it. Then it was just like you just dealt with things. And so I was really, really anxious. Like I had my first panic attack when I was 21, when I was my senior year in college, was rejected from many, many jobs I had applied to, which were not in the field of psychology, because that was a shift for me. But I really felt paralyzed in many ways by this feeling. And I did seek out therapy after college, and I was working with a therapist for, a couple of years, but the anxiety was still there for me, and it was still palpable in so many areas of my life. And then I had this experience with my aunt, and the anxiety dissipated. And it was like my understanding of death, and I think so much of anxiety is rooted in a fear of death, that once I was able to really embrace death in a different way, that anxiety just melted away.
And do you think that was it that your aunt, knowing that she was really communicating and that these messages were real, that she was in like a better place, alleviated the anxiety? Or I'm kind of wondering, because for you, it's not like you had a near death where you crossed over and you saw what was there. And that really, I'm just curious about this shift, because I know what you're talking about. And I've experienced that, but I'm just kind of wondering if you can put a little bit more words to what it was that gave you that sense of peace that made the anxiety drop, or did you not know at the time?
Yeah, I think I didn't know at the time. So much of this has really been a reflection of looking back too, and looking at, oh wow, like I was really anxious and then I wasn't really anxious. And the only difference, and I was in therapy for a long time. I was in therapy for 17 years, dealing with all different kinds of things that were coming up, and being in graduate school as a therapist. I really believe strongly that you should have your own therapy. You should know kind of where your own pitfalls are going to come in, what gets triggered for you when you're talking with someone. So that was something that I really held very fastidious to in my clinical work. And so I think really it's been sort of the retrospect experience. But I remember, I share that anecdote about my aunt, or that story about my aunt and the visit I had from her, as my first experience. But really, there was a first experience that came before that. I just didn't know that's what it was at the time.
And what was that experience?
Yeah, in that visit, my aunt came to me, and she was wearing a red sweater. She was on a golf course, and there's some meaning behind that in terms of her relationship with my mom. And my mom's an avid golfer, and my mom it's kind of I think this is like a funny psychological manifestation of grief. Is one of the things that my mom loves, and is her passion since she was a little kid. It was how she and my grandfather bonded, because their home backed up to a golf course. And so they didn't belong to the golf club. But at the end of the day, my grandfather would take my mom out to hit golf balls. And so she was really good, and continues to be a really excellent golfer. But how her grief manifested for her was she ended up like playing horrible golf. And it really impacted. I know it sounds kind of silly, but it was something that she loved and was so passionate about. And I think felt a lot of survivor's guilt around her living, and my aunt having such a difficult life and really struggling, and my mom feeling like she never had health issues like my aunt had. And she had to really watch all of that throughout her life, and watch my aunt really struggle with everything. And so how it manifested for my mom was really like impacting her game and then taking her enjoyment out of it. And so when my aunt came to me, and she was on the golf course, and she looked so beautiful. Like I remember her, she was just glowing, and she always looked very sickly to me growing up. Like that's the image I have of her, because she was sick for most of the time. I mean, very sick. And then she went through a divorce, and the stress of that added to her frailty and her sickness, and probably ultimately her untimely death. But she was just beaming. And she said, let everybody know I'm okay. I'm healthy over here. My body has healed. And I think it was like those two experiences that left me feeling like, okay, there might be something to this, that this physical reality that we see and experience every day isn't all that there is.
That's beautiful. So tell me, when you did finally kind of accept the call or follow your, instructor's recommendation, how did this all open up for you, and how has it evolved into, it sounds like it's part of your practice.
It is, but probably not in the way people would assume it would be. So after I had multiple experiences, and then it started with the patients, and I started working with this medium, and she really encouraged me. I mean, she started to teach me, like, this is how you open up. This is how you protect yourself. This is how you ground yourself. This is what the signs and the symbols and they all mean. And so then you'll appreciate this, being the, forever student that those of us in these fields tend to be, right? I feel like I'm never not learning, and I'm curious, and I always want to expand. I was like, I have to do an internship. I can't just put out a shingle and call myself a medium. Like that would seem crazy. So I literally constructed my own little internship where I, for free, opened it up to anybody. I sent an email out to friends and friends of friends and acquaintances, and said that just forward it on. And if anybody wants a reading, I'll do a reading. And so what was supposed to be a month turned into 3 months. And I think I did over 30 or 40 readings, and they were great. But I still felt like, okay, so you had a reading. Now what? What do you do with that information? And obviously I'm in the now what camp, because this is what I do for a living, right? I'm a therapist. I want to take people deeper. So I'm like, okay, what are we going to do? What do you do with this information once you have it? How do you use that? Other than it being really validating, and for many people, I think it can be really, really helpful in their grief in terms of helping them move forward from what they've experienced and feel that connection. The now what for me wasn't there in the mediumship space. And so I just was like, all right, I'm going to be back at my clinical work. I was still having these experiences. I would have flashes of patients who had past lives, or I would go in and meditate and ask the question, like, where is this person stuck? And then I would see them at either, like, I would get an image of kind of a space maybe they were in, or an age that they were at. And so I just started to subtly bring that into the work that we were doing and say things like, tell me what happened around the age of 9 for you, and just see if those things would open up and unlock doors for them. And they would. And so it's not, and I don't say, I just saw that you were stuck at the age of 9 with something, right? It's just much more integrated for me. And I don't do straight medium work because, one, I think that there's a lot of mediums that are way, way better than I am. And it should be such a sacred experience and can be so powerful and healing with the right person, which is not me for the mediumship experience, that I wanted people, when they were having that experience, that it feel really validating. And then what they do with it, they can come to me, process it. I have had patients whose loved ones have come through in sessions. And now that they know that I do this, I've shared with them just that, I think your loved one is here. How would you feel about me, like, sharing what they're sharing?
And I can imagine when this first started happening in your practice, and you're not necessarily, people are initially, I would assume people are not coming to you because they know that you're also a medium. That what was that like to share that? And actually, when you said you sent an email to all your friends and family, I'm like also thinking, like, what is this like to come out and share that you have these gifts and you want to use them in a meaningful way, both like with your family, but then also with your patients?
So I never told my patients. They only found out about it once I launched the podcast. So for a long time, I was having these experiences and I never said a word. And I did test it out with some family and friends. And I had a couple of people that thought, wow, that's really cool. And a couple of people that just totally shut it down. And so I shut it down for longer, because it wasn't until I was at a place where I felt like this was my truth. I had had so many of these experiences, and I'm not even counting like all the signs and synchronicities and crazy stuff that happened beyond just like these few that I'm sharing, that it became so my reality that it no longer mattered. For so long, it mattered what other people thought. And I was so afraid of sharing this for what other people were going to think and say. And am I, crazy, or am I, delusional or hallucinating? I mean, I'm in the field of psychology. And so I think that once I got to a place where I was like, you know what? I don't care if people think it's real or not real. This is what I've experienced. I know that there are other people who have experienced it as well. And so I'm just going to share that and let other people open up and make their own decision about what they want to believe or not believe. It's not my job to convince anybody. I just want to show people what's possible. I want to share with them what I've experienced, because hopefully they can experience it too, because it changes your experience in the world, and it makes life so much more fun and meaningful.
And when was that you were so convicted that you didn't feel the need to convince anyone? You're just like, this is who I am, and this is what I'm bringing, to my practice and my life.
I think it was when, everybody who's a medium will say, not everybody, but a lot of people who are mediums will say things like, I couldn't not do this anymore. Like I couldn't deny this part of myself. I couldn't not be a medium. I was like so pushed into it. And that's sort of how I felt about sharing this. It started to feel like there was this entire part of me that had no place to be expressed. And I really, every time I had the conversations, and still to this day, 6 years, almost 6 years or 5 years into my podcast, it is still the thing that lights me up the most, is having these conversations with people around this topic, because I think it has the ability to expand our consciousness and really change the world. And so when I felt like that push that just kept pushing, I was like, I just have to be out there, and the chips will fall where they may. And if that means that I lose all my patients, I guess that's what it will be, which didn't happen.
Hey, it's Dr. Katie. You may have noticed that I talk a lot about water on this podcast. After a year of research, I've learned that optimal water needs 3 key elements: filtration, mineralization, and structure, just like natural spring water. Doing all these steps to my own drinking water took me several hours a week. That's why I'm so impressed with Spring Aqua. Their system incorporates all 3 elements in one system that is basically modeling its technology after the renowned healing waters of the spring at Lourdes, France. I personally use their Wet 7 model, which offers alkalinized hydrogen water and saves me hours each week. Spring Aqua has dramatically improved hydration for both me and my family, and I believe it could do the same for you. I recently had the owner, Kenny Lou, on the show, and his integrity really shines through in this product. If you're interested in experiencing truly hydrating water that mimics nature's process, please visit the link in the episode description. Yeah, so tell us, so what happened then when you had this feeling? And actually, I love what you said, that there was a part of me that had no place to express itself, and that this was really, part of your healing, to express your wholeness and allow your whole being to be expressed in the world, even though that may have been scary. What a beautiful and courageous step.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I remember when I made the call to one of the doctors that refers patients to me. I live in Chicago. These are doctors at Northwestern. And I reached out and I said, just want you to know I'm launching this podcast. It might be a little out there for some people. And since then, I've gone even further out than I was then. And so I have people on who channel light beings from other dimensions. And, I talk about all kinds of different modalities of healing that tend to be more in the spiritual space than the traditional medical space. And he was like, okay, totally unfazed by it. And so, are there people that have maybe looked at my website and been like, yeah, I'm not going to call that woman? Perhaps. I don't know about it, but it has not been a problem at all. I still have a very full practice. I'm always referring out because I just don't have enough time to see the people that there's just not enough hours in the week, but it was not how I thought it would go.
Yeah. Well, and thank goodness, because it's, I think, so this is the thing that, I've had an experience. I had my first real, that I remember, a metaphysical experience as a shared death experience when someone else was transitioning, and I somehow connected with her soul as she transitioned, and I felt the light and the love and the beauty and all of that. It took me a little bit of time to even admit that had happened to me, because I just felt so weird. I was like, I don't know what that means. I don't know if that makes me weird or a medium or what. And so just even admitting when something like that happens can be, really challenging. That opened something where I've, now know that I have the gift that I can walk someone through that initial part of letting go in the death process. And I've never actually talked about this on my podcast, but I'm like, okay, well, here we go. Here's something right in front of you that I can either, stand up and say, I understand this, or I can pretend like I'm someone that I'm not. But basically it opened me to realize that I have that gift of helping people release, letting go in the initial transition when someone is dying, and used it with my patients. So I did this when I was in my traditional medical practice. There was one of my young patients. She was in her 30s, and I'd become very close with her and her husband because she'd been my patient for like 15 years. And she ended up like having like just this rapid decline while I was on vacation, and her husband, not getting the answers that he wanted at the hospital. And they had such a good relationship with me. He just started texting me on my phone, and she was clearly transitioning. And so I was like, okay, I have a choice here. Either I can tell him that I potentially might be able to help just smooth her transition, or I'm just going to pretend like I don't have it and not say anything. And it was important enough to me to serve her and him if I could in the moment. And so basically was able to check in with her and see where she was at. And initially, like, she wasn't ready. And this was one thing that like I knew when she was awake and talking to me, she was not ready. They had a young daughter and she did not want to go. But so she was resisting. And I just kept coming in and I would go into meditation and I would just check on her. Like, where is she? Does she need my help? Or is she okay? And she was like, no, no, no. She was kind of like this. And so I was like, yeah, absolutely. I just want you to know that I'm here if you do need me. And this was like over like 4 days. And it happened to be that I was on vacation by myself. Like, I had gone to do like study and stuff, like working on something, but it was actually a real blessing because I had this time and space. And ultimately she was like, come in, I need you. And then, I was able to help her. But then the other thing, and I've never talked about this, was that, when you do this kind of work and you start to open to it, other guides will come in. And Mother Teresa came in and she showed me. She's like, I'm going to show you how to walk her home. And so over like 2 days, Mother Teresa kept coming into my meditations and taught me things. And basically it was like, you take her hand, I'm going to take your hand, and I'm just going to show you how this happens. And ultimately I was able to walk her. And with each person, now that it's happened, it's different. What is visually there is different with each person depending on what they need. Right. And so I saw basically like this, it was almost like a hill up to like a tunnel. And I knew that she needed to go up the hill into the tunnel, but I was like, it's okay. Whenever you're ready, you can go. And then ultimately when she went up to the top of the hill, I saw this giant, it looked like a bear, but it was clearly a man, this bear that like put his arm around her and she said, Daddy. And then there was another woman who was there who was like very petite, who came up on her other side. And after all of this happened, I asked her husband if her dad had passed before her. And he said, yes. And I said, would you mind showing me a picture of him? Sure enough, he's like 6'3", 300 pound, looks like a bear. And so this experience for me was kind of maybe for you, where it gave me conviction of like, oh, this is real. Like, what just happened was real. And I didn't know, I still don't use it necessarily with clients. I mean, probably maybe now I'll end up using it, but it's just interesting. So I absolutely know this journey you've been on.
Yeah. And I have the goosebumps as you're sharing this story, because I think one of the things that's been really interesting in this work, and I'm kind of working with, I've just started some conversations with Mental Health America, which is the largest non-for-profit for mental health. And so many practitioners have experiences like this. In, so many of us that are healers in these spaces who work with patients and get very close with people and have these deep, meaningful connections. And then they have the experience you're talking about. Or, I'll never forget, years ago, I interviewed an ER physician who had another patient come into the ER. And before he knew that the patient's wife and son had both passed in a car accident, because he saw them come in before he did, not embodied. They were disembodied. And so he saw their spirits, and he knew that this man had lost his family in this car accident, and the man was unconscious for quite some time, and they became friends, but he had this experience. And again, like doors blown open. Suddenly he's, someone who's typical physician who's like, okay, what's going on here? And there's so many people who are having these experiences, not talking about them, not diving deeper, not opening up more. And I just think we could be, one, so much more whole if we opened up to them. And two, we could heal each other in different ways if we opened up to them. Like, I really believe that. And I think spirituality is such a powerful modality in healing as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm wondering, is that physician, is that Jeff O'Driscoll?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. So funny. I was like, I think that's Jeff. He just texted me yesterday. So
Randomly?
yes, not randomly, right? Obviously, synchronistically.
Right. But like synchronistically?
Yeah. So I know Jeff because he's actually how I found out what a shared death experience was when that happened to me. That he was like, that is a thing. And I was like, I didn't know that. So that he was the person who I learned that from. And then we've stayed in connection. And
that's so random. And he is, I mean, not random. This is, I think, a real life example of a crazy synchronicity. I've interviewed like almost 400 people. But he came back into my orbit this week.
Oh, that's
like, I haven't heard from him in a couple of years. And he just texted me this week about something.
That's so interesting. So the thing that I think is so intriguing for me about what you're doing and then also bringing this out on your podcast is normalizing it. That's one of the things, that is one of the reasons why I do share about my shared death experience, just to normalize it, that these things happen to people. And it's interesting, why I haven't shared that I've used it, in other scenarios, kind of intentionally, because that was, by accident, if not by accident, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I wasn't trying to do that when that happened, but I love that you're bringing this to people's attention and normalizing it to make it okay. Cause like for me, I'm one of those people, it was scary for me. I didn't want people to think I was weird or something was wrong with me. And it wasn't something that I could control. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, like what this has been like to, bring this out for people and make it more acceptable.
Well, I think that one, hopefully it gives people permission to talk about these experiences, and that hopefully you'll share it with the right people and there won't be retribution or, no one's going to think you're having a hallucination or you need to be psychiatrically hospitalized for it. They're actually doing research at Yale now through the COPE project on perceptual experiences, these kind of, mediumship, spirit guide experiences that people have. It's a psychiatrist. So clearly this is, if Yale is starting to research it, it's becoming more in the zeitgeist of what we're talking about. But I think that, it's really, I want to give people permission to share these experiences. I want clinicians to open themselves up to encouraging patients to share these experiences if they've had them. If they've not, that's fine too. But so many patients have had these experiences and they don't bring them into therapy, and then they can't process them. And it's a way to continue to move through. It might be grief, but it might be other things too. You can have people who've had near-death experiences that are transformed by them. It actually reminds me, like, I've worked with people who've had these experiences and they want to make sense of them, and they don't want it to be dismissed and they don't want it to be minimized, because they are such profound experiences in people's lives that literally change the trajectory of their lives as well.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting point, that for your clients, because this is not something that only happens, for example, the two of us are, serving in some capacity, you as a psychologist, me as a physician. This happens to everyone, like so many people have these metaphysical experiences that I didn't even think about that for your clients. It must be so nice to see someone that they can openly explain if they are having these experiences and, receive like sound guidance, because that's the other thing is like, where do you turn to get guidance if you're receiving information, and how to cultivate that gift without, like misusing it or, whatever, like not, I don't know what, but it's like any skill. It's like you need to learn how to use it. So I'm curious about that with your own clients.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I still practice traditional psychotherapy. And I think a big part of that is from the kind of real traditional psychodynamic, psychoanalytic perspective. It's about making the unconscious conscious. We call it all these other things now, mindfulness, awareness, but really it is about our unconscious and making that conscious and then becoming more conscious in everyday life. And so I think that when I can help people move to that place of being more conscious, aware, and mindful in their everyday life, then they start to notice these experiences more. And I've had a number of people who have come to me in grief that they've maybe been stuck in for years. And I'll say, what is your belief system about what happens after you die? And some people, not all, but some will say, I do believe there's an afterlife and I believe that our soul goes on. And, I've never shared this before, kind of like what you said, but I've had these experiences that make me think, maybe my mom, dad, sibling, whomever is still watching or they're still with me. I've just had these crazy experiences and here's one of them. And so they start to share them and then they start to happen more. And they start to notice them more and they become more open to them. And then the relationship with their loved one continues beyond the physical death. And again, it's not a replacement for the grief. Like I don't believe, and I say this all the time, like if something happened to one of my children, this is a great belief system and I would be taken down to my knees. Like there's no question it would be. Even knowing everything I know and believing everything I believe, I still am a human being who still has very intense range of feelings and I feel them all. And, I think it would be the most devastating thing I would ever go through. And all the other stuff would come into play. All my other belief systems would come into play at some point, I hope. But ultimately, I lost someone I loved and they are not in a physical body anymore. And the relationship is going to be different. And that's something as a human being you have to deal with.
I mean, so many people long to have connection with their loved ones who have transitioned. And what a gift to be able to communicate, but it doesn't take away that grief. The grief is the loss of them in the physical body, of you connecting and really having a life with them, right? And being able to physically touch and see them. And there's always going to be grief that's associated with having any kind of shift like that. And even if you have an understanding that they're okay and they're communicating, it's still like that grief is real. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And it needs to be felt and experienced. It cannot be spiritual bypassing is something I talk a lot about too. It cannot be bypassed by all these spiritual practices or belief systems because then that to me diminishes the point of spirituality.
Yeah. Can you speak to spiritual bypassing? I'm not sure if, my audience are all familiar with that. Like, what do you mean when you say that?
So spiritual bypassing, I think John Wellwood coined the term, and basically it means sort of using traditional spiritual practices like yoga or meditation. Now we have like all these positive thinking and, breath work and sound meditation, like all these sort of considered kind of more alternative healing practices, but that you do those, but you never actually really deal with the feelings there, right? Like meditation is a practice, and part of that practice is oftentimes you can feel things really intensely, but what do you do with that once it comes up? Do you just say, well, I meditate, so that's enough? No, you still have to deal with all of these feelings and experiences that arise versus using these tools as a way to say, well, I'm dealing with it because I meditate or do yoga or even psychedelics now, which is a whole other thing. Like, are people just using that as a magic bullet or panacea? And then they're not really dealing with what's beneath, what lies beneath, using mediumship as a way to not deal with the grief.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I see this actually in my practice. So a lot of people, with cancer there's emotional components, right? There's like, to make us whole, we really need emotional, mental, and spiritual practices and healing, right, to bring us back to wholeness. But one of the things that I see with a lot of people who I take care of with cancer is they have things that are under the surface. Maybe it's past trauma or things that are unresolved that are, under the surface for them, but they have really good coping skills that they've just learned how to cope over them. And that on the surface, everything looks really put together and buttoned up. And you're like, I don't understand, because they're so positive. They seem to have such a, good outlook. Like if this positivity, you direct your mind to what you want and that's how you get it. It's like, why are they not getting what they want? Why is this illness like coming up in their body? And what you're describing is like, basically, this, like, I don't know if that would be considered spiritual bypassing, but basically they're bypassing, dealing with what is under the surface there. And their body is showing them there's something, wrong that needs to be healed. But it's so interesting. It kind of takes a little bit of teasing at to help them see, oh, there may be something emotional here that is under the surface.
And I always liken emotions to like whack-a-moles. Like, remember that game, that whack-a-mole game where you like whack the mole down, but it pops up somewhere else? If you don't deal with it, it's just going to do that. You're just whacking it down for it to pop up somewhere else. And sometimes it pops up in the physical body, right? Sometimes it pops up in the emotional body I think it often pops up physically, but there's symptoms of emotion, like anxiety, depression, right? You start to see it manifesting in that way, but you have to deal with it. Otherwise, it's gonna be there. It's gonna come up.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny that you use the whack-a-mole analogy, because I use that with my patients. So radiation for breast cancer, most of my patients had breast cancer, and radiation is kind of like the last treatment in like breast cancer treatment. And then they might take anti-estrogen or something, but they're not coming to the doctor for chemo or radiation or whatever. And so I saw very commonly that they would get depressed and anxious as they were finishing or getting close to finishing. And this was very unexpected for them, because they're thinking, I'm going to be so excited when this is over. I'm going to be ringing the bell and celebrating. And that is not what I saw. Like, a lot of them would just get really anxious. Because think about it, you've been with these doctors like every day. They were coming to my clinic every day for radiation and seeing the doctors once a week. And they had been doing like treatments, chemo and radiation and surgery, and seeing all these doctors for so long. And then all of a sudden we're all just like letting them go. And they're like, what? And so I would prepare them. If you feel anxious, if you feel depressed, it's like very normal. Like you're just stepping, it's a transition. And so you just want to, but you want to allow yourself to feel what comes up, because you didn't have the emotional space to deal with the emotional impact of the diagnosis, while you were going through all this treatment and so busy with us. And now that we're stopping, not only is it scary because it's it's different and a change and uncertainty, but you also have all of that emotional unpacking to do from the diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't allow it to come up and at least show itself, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole. And I explain that to them. I'm like, you might as well allow it to come now, because it makes sense. Like, people are like, if you kind of prepare your family that this may happen as I'm finishing, it makes sense. But if you blow past it, like, 3 months down the road, you're going to be blowing up your husband about unrelated stuff, because there's all of this under the surface that was there. It's just, you didn't create space to feel it. So
exactly.
Anyway, I use that whack-a-mole analogy.
Well, and I think to your point, you get a diagnosis and you move, you're in action, right? You're constantly like doing something. And then you get to the end and you're like, oh no, what am I doing now? How am I going to deal with this now that it's over? Like, what is the work? How do I keep doing something to make sure that this doesn't come back? I don't have a recurrence, or, all of those things. And so, yeah, your point is like all of that has to get processed. It's like if you just kept dumping garbage in a garbage disposal or in a garbage can, but never took the garbage out, it's just going to smell and get gross over time.
Yes. That's actually an awesome analogy. I really like that one. It is. It's just like it gets smelly, it's like garbage piling up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that muck piles up in our systems, in our emotional systems too.
Well, it has been such a privilege speaking with you. I didn't know actually where this was going. It's kind of interesting. So we'll see. This is new for my audience, but
I hope they like it.
yeah, I think that it's important, like the work that you're doing is important, but it's also important for me to just acknowledge that these things happen to me. And it feels weird because I don't really know how to explain it to other people, but it's also like a gift, right? So how beautiful that I could help someone through something that can be really scary and terrifying. And the one thing that I will say that's come from all of that, and this is why I asked you about that shift that you had, after that experience, is like, I had a complete shift. I am not afraid of what happens after this. If anything, I feel like this is, if you were going to call something a hell, this is the place of contrast. This is where it is really tough. And outside of this, when we shed this body, it's beautiful. Like that's actually during my shared death experience. What happened when she transitioned was she gasped and she said, "Oh, it's so beautiful." And then I was just engulfed by this beauty that I just can't even describe. And so I have that where I'm not afraid of death. So that's a beautiful gift that I have for people who are close to death to, be able to say, I've seen what is beyond this. And I don't know that it's the same for everyone, but what I saw was just incredible. And I have just this sense of peace that I can bring to those people who are close to their own transition. So thank you for bringing it out of me today on my own podcast. And I know soon we'll be meeting so that I can be a guest on your podcast.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this more on my podcast. But what I think is so amazing, and I hope your listeners, I hope they like this episode, even if it's not like in line with how you usually do this work. But my God, if I had a doctor who I was nearing death and I knew that doctor not only could guide me from the physical perspective, but also could help me exit from the spiritual, like into this other realm in a way that felt really like could hold my hand both physically and spiritually. I mean, I'd be first in line to have you as my doctor if that was the path I was going down, because I just feel like that's such meaningful work, right? Like we hire birth doulas and midwives and doctors, and we've got like 75 people in the room when we're having a baby and we're bringing this soul into the world. And there's like no one there when we leave.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was absolutely a privilege, and I'm excited to see what my listeners think. So thank you for being here, Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have you back on my podcast, and we're going to dive deep into this.
Thank you for joining me on Born to Heal. It's been a privilege to share this time with you, and I hope that today's episode has offered you valuable insights on your journey toward optimal health. Please consider subscribing, sharing this podcast with your friends, and leaving us a review. To learn more about how you can work with me, please visit katiedeming.com. You can find additional resources in the episode show notes linked below, and remember to join us next week as we continue to explore more holistic approaches to healing. Until then, this is Dr. Katie Deming, reminding you that just like me, you were born to heal. What if healing cancer didn't have to be so overwhelming and confusing? What if you could access a higher level of consciousness to accelerate healing? And what if you had a clear roadmap to follow, a path to lead you out of the fear and uncertainty? Hi, I'm Dr. Katie Deming. As an oncologist who's cared for thousands of patients, let me guide you safely through the fog. My 6 Pillars of Healing Cancer workshop series is now available, and it's not too late to join. Choose from a range of powerful workshops, each designed to support your healing journey, covering nutrition, emotional well-being, hydration, physical practices, the mind-body connection, and spirituality. Select only the workshops that align with you, or for a limited time, buy the entire bundle and enjoy significant savings. Don't miss this proven holistic roadmap to clarity and deep inner calm to support your healing process. Check the link in this episode's description to learn more and sign up today. Remember, you've got this.